Hello everyone, Jester Bell is back, and as much as I keep saying that I don't even want to think about Starfleet Academy anymore, you guys keep watching my videos of it, cursing me to a fate of thinking about this show all the more. But it's important to talk about still, important to talk about in terms of what has happened to the various franchises that we love and understanding it and trying to find a way to move forward. So more Starfleet Academy videos it is. However, I must warn you, this video is not just about Starfleet Academy. You might be hearing a lot of talk about Marvel Comics and the changes therein as well, because in this video, I am going to address the defenders of Starfleet Academy. And yes, believe it or not, there are defenders of Starfleet Academy still. Maybe not as many as before, but it goes along with just some of what I would call the non-arguments that have been happening against fans who don't like the changes that have obviously happened to the various series and franchise and characters that they once loved. But yes, there's been this idea for a long time now, and we all know that Starfleet Academy is horrible. It's almost universally agreed upon, but there's still some stragglers trying to invalidate the criticism against this show. Now, for a long time, you've had Star Trek fans who hate what it's become and have spoken out against it or just become apathetic and turned away. And for a long time, the defenders of it, the defenders of the changes for Star Trek, have said that the show actually isn't for you, that Star Trek was always a progressive show, and that if you don't like that, then you must not have either gotten it in the first place or it was never for you in the first place. And it's still progressive, and so anyone complaining about that is just clearly a poser or just never got it. Now, some of that discussion may have faded away, but, the Mary Sue, which is an article that honestly has stirred up controversy for the various takes on these franchises over the years. And once upon a time, like years ago, I remember them being at the forefront in pushing and gatekeeping these kinds of changes. I don't know if they're that relevant now. They made an article that was essentially doing that to fans, saying that Starfleet Academy is not for the people who are criticizing it. No, not just Starfleet Academy, but Star Trek in general is not for the people who are criticizing Starfleet Academy. Not for these dude bros with their action figures and their middle age. That's actually exactly who Star Trek is for. But because it was always progressive. Essentially, that is the defense that comes to the modern Star Trek show's defense. Sorry, I repeated myself. This is an off-the-cuff video. But that's the defense, is that Star Trek was always progressive. If you criticize any of the ideology or where that ideology has taken Star Trek now, then it was never for you, and you're just, I suppose, a bigot.
I watch birds.
Now, I want to address that because it has this kind of argument has come about for multiple franchises, and it's come about for Marvel Comics as well. It's come about for X-Men, which is my favorite corner of Marvel Comics, which is why we're going to bring that up here too. The idea that these are progressive franchises and that they were never made for you and you're just a bigot and that's why you don't like it. Maybe you never even understood Star Trek. Now, this is a brain-dead argument that is completely ignoring the context and actual content of these shows and comics. When they're talking about progressivism, they're just taking a surface-level look, saying, oh, well, the idea behind the original Star Trek is that it was very progressive, right? Or the idea behind the X-Men is very, very progressive, themes of anti-racism and all of that. And that's still what they are today, right? Like, Star Trek today is very, very progressive. And so if you don't like that, then you're just, your ideas are just antithetical to Star Trek. But once again, that is taking a surface-level look. The idea that merely because these shows are both trying to be progressive for what that means in the day and age they were made means that they are the same. But it's not. And it's not that the fans who criticize these changes didn't get Star Trek or X-Men or whatever have you, as we're going to get into. So, like I just said, and I touched on this in a video about Starfleet Academy before, but I want to expand upon it, but progressivism, the definition behind the word, what it means to be progressive, that is going to change based on the time you are living in. It was different in the 1960s, it was different in the 2010s and early 2020s, and it's going to be different 10 to 20 years from now. And you see, when you actually don't look at a broad stroke look at these shows and just say, oh, well, it's progressive, then if you actually look into the details and what they were saying and the clips, then you actually see that, like, old Trek versus new Trek are the antithesis of each other, as well as, I'll say, some of modern X-Men is the antithesis of the old classic X-Men comics. And a lot of the things that they have done in modern Marvel movies are actually against the ideology and ideas that were presented in original Marvel comics through the 70s and 80s. So it might not be so much that the audience is bigoted or has changed and become bigoted, is also one of the arguments that I've seen, but it's actually that the media, the ideology, and the people behind it and their beliefs have drastically changed in the various decades. So let's start with Star Trek, for example. Like, what was the actual ideas behind Star Trek? Now, Star Trek was always a diverse show. You have Sulu, who was one of the helmsmen, and then you had Chekhov was one of the helmsmen, and then you had a black female in Uhura being chief communications officer. It was definitely a diverse cast. But were those characters just there to show that they were diverse and to make a statement on that? Well, they were trying to make a statement, but it was more so not a statement, but an idea. And I'm fully acknowledging I'm not the first person to say these things, but I just wanted to expand upon it. An idea for the future, because when the original Star Trek came out, we were going through the Cold War. We had just come out of World War II. A lot of people who were in World War II worked on the show, including the actor for Scotty, who actually lost a finger in World War II and had to hide that throughout the show. We were going through the civil rights movement right there. It was in the heat of it. So what Star Trek was presenting here as an idea was that, look, we have a black woman as the chief communications officer. We have a Japanese man as a helmsman. We have a Russian as his fellow helmsman. It was the idea that there was going to be progress in the future. The idea that, look at all that we've just come through and that we're going through right now. But in the future, we are going to have progress. In Star Trek, there was still racism between different species from completely different planets. But the idea is that on Earth at least, racism had been eliminated, along with things like poverty and hunger with the replicators. Star Trek was an incredibly positive view, a very positive outlook on the future. The idea that, whatever struggles in the future, we were going to make progress.
Young lady, I come from a time when men achieved power and wealth by standing on the backs of the poor, where prejudice and intolerance are commonplace and power is an end unto itself. And you're telling me that isn't how it is anymore?
That's right.
There's a scene in one of the episodes where, it's a crazy show, a lot of crazy stuff can happen here. They meet who they think is Abraham Lincoln, and he makes a comment that he thinks is going to be offensive to Uhura. And she tells him that in this day and age, they've learned not to fear words. They wouldn't be offended by just a word.
Forgive me, my dear. I know that in my time, some use that term as a description of property.
But why should I object to that term, sir? You see, in our century, we've learned not to fear words.
Which is completely antithetical to today's beliefs, or at least what we just came through, where it became more about the sensitivity to words. And we had, cancel culture that is luckily over now. But for a while, there were people who were looking into people's past and trying to find awful tweets to destroy their careers. And a single sentence and a single word could ruin your entire career. But Star Trek presented the idea where people would not be offended by mere words anymore. So just for that, brief rundown, Star Trek was a show about optimism and that we would make progress in the future and that we would put aside our differences and there would be no more poverty, no more starvation, no more racism. We couldn't be hurt by just mere words anymore. Now that is completely different than modern Trek. As soon as you get to Picard, which was the first of Alex Kurtzman's Trek, It presents a very bleak world where everything has gotten worse and they're swearing and everyone is angry and everything is dark. Star Trek Picard was a very nihilistic view of the future, which is what I believe that we've seen a lot these days, is a lot of nihilism. Now let's fast forward a bit to Starfleet Academy. Starfleet Academy opens up with a mother and son who were trying to steal food because there wasn't enough, which completely goes against the original idea of Star Trek, where they had replicators so that there would not be a food shortage within the Federation. The original Star Trek was written by people who had been through World War II. In fact, a lot of TV back then was written by people who were also novelists and had a more mature adult look on the world. But modern Trek is run by people who are in the Hollywood bubble. Perhaps they've never even experienced anything else, and they're in this bubble of the same rich people, cycled through the same nepotism of Hollywood over the years, and they might not have any other experience. So I think part of that is the result is Starfleet Academy is incredibly juvenile. The original Star Trek shows, and they were not perfect, but it always felt like they had a question to ask. Like, you didn't even have to agree with them, but every time they did an episode that would cover a topic, like there's an episode in Next Generation where two characters think they're dead, and that causes one of the characters to consider the beliefs she was raised on in terms of an afterlife and what actually happens when you die. Now, with this, it's just like the idea that Star Trek is constantly asking questions about the afterlife and different beliefs people have. And you feel like the writers always have something on their minds. Not all the episodes were perfect, but they wanted to learn more. But these sort of lessons that we get in, say, Starfleet Academy, the last episode was like this juvenile war between two colleges and one pranked the other, and then the supervisor tells them, maybe they should take care of this plant in order to learn patience and empathy.
We are going to plant and grow the rare and highly protected Vetus reflux. Despite being known as the empathy flower, it's not actually a flower. It's a fungus.
It is a kindergarten's level of understanding. It isn't being written by intellectual people who are thinking of the future, thinking about questions to life. It's being written by people of, I would argue, a very, very low IQ and a very, very limited understanding of the world and very, very few lessons to teach. But Starfleet Academy is not perhaps concerned with having super intellectual takes on the world or asking questions, but it is concerned with checking boxes, where we've got our gay Klingon, we've got our overweight characters to promote body positivity, we've got our female Jem'Hadar who shouldn't exist and she's married to the inclusivity trainer. That is a reflection of modern day progressivism, or I would say the progressivism of 5 years ago, perhaps. We've seen trends in media recently where concerns over toxic masculinity have just spread to all masculinity being toxic. So Starfleet Academy becomes a very feminized show because it was traditionally a franchise for men. Women could like it too, but it was traditionally a male-skewing franchise, and it has to become feminized, and that is a reflection of the modern day progressivism that sees all masculinity as toxic. Now, what I am getting at here, and I'm not saying that you have to agree with one school of thought or the other, but I am showing there is a change. There is a change on what would be considered progressive in the late 1960s when Star Trek came out, even the 80s when TNG came out, and now with Starfleet Academy. Now, where there's going to be different schools of thought here and what you agree with, and to the degree on what you agree with things on, here is what I'll say. I think a lot of times these modern progressive shows are rejected because there isn't a lot of truth to them. I apologize, I know I'm rambling, this is all off the cuff. There isn't a lot of truth to these modern day shows though, which is why I think a lot of people reject them. For example, with the whole body positivity thing in this show, Starfleet Academy, it doesn't make sense. This is a military academy. You need people to be at their peak physical strength. You can't have a lot of 5-foot-tall women or people who are clearly out of shape in this military academy. You can't have people who are infantilized and treated like children in this military academy. maybe that adds up with some people's modern day beliefs where what is traditionally masculine has to be feminized, and maybe they feel more comfortable if things are more childish, and maybe that feels more accessible to the people who are writing this. And with body positivity, like, that's, I guess, part of the ideology of the people behind the scenes. But the problem is it doesn't actually add up with this setting, so it becomes rejected by people. But the main point of all of this is it's not that people who loved original Star Trek didn't get it, and it's not that the people who loved original Star Trek grew up to be bigots either. It's that the ideology behind the scenes and the people working on it changed. That is what actually happened behind the scenes. Now, I said that I wasn't going to just talk about Star Trek in this video. I wanted to talk about Marvel Comics as well, because that is another brand. And I'll say this especially about the X-Men, and I love the X-Men, but that's another brand where I've seen it come into some controversy in the modern times about what they're supposed to stand for and what they're supposed to mean. Now, there was a controversy recently, or I guess a couple years ago now, over X-Men 97 announcing that Morph, a character who's portrayed as a man who's best friends with Wolverine in the original show, he is a shapeshifter, but they were going to make him identify as non-binary in the new show. And it's actually revealed by the end that he actually has an unrequited crush on Wolverine. Now, it's barely anything in the show, but when they announced this, and I personally think this was just the Disney at the time trying to get brownie points, but when they announced this, it came under controversy for changing the original version of the character, to which more modern-day X-Men fans that agreed with it said that anyone who opposed this change for the character was the equivalent of the bigots in X-Men who hold signs. And even the people who worked on the show in the original X-Men show in the 90s said that, oh, anyone who doesn't like this change must not have gotten the original X-Men and the lessons that it was going to teach if they didn't like this change. And this is a broader conversation that I've seen come around X-Men that, how can a bigot ever like X-Men? X-Men was always this way. Now, there's a little bit of a confusion there on what the X-Men are supposed to be about. So X-Men, in its most popular form, is a very, very political book. Now, some people will say, oh, it was never intended to be political by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are not what made the X-Men popular. X-Men by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby was one of their failed ideas when it got taken over by a different creative team later in the 70s and became what we know it today with the allegory of racism and all of that and more deeper themes. That is when it got really popular. But here is the thing. The politics of the X-Men and the beliefs of it changed over time as the people in control of those comics changed. For example, if you read X-Men comics in the 80s, Chris Claremont, who wrote the majority of them, he would often have a minority character or a character from a culture who had historically been oppressed and mistreated. He would have them be portrayed as maybe one of the biggest. Like Magneto is the biggest example. He was a Jewish man, a survivor of the Holocaust, who had become totalitarian and a villain. And the entire idea behind his character is no matter what background you're from or how oppressed you've been or what culture you're from, it doesn't give you a right to take out your pain on other people. It doesn't give you a right to become the very thing you hate. Now, sometimes Chris Claremont would do that way. For example, a black character would be the one who was portrayed as anti-mutant or something like that. Or a black character would be one of the good guys. Basically, any character in X-Men could be a hero, and any character, no matter what their race or cultural background or whatever it may be, could be a villain. And what Claremont was doing with that is not only saying that, whatever background you have, anyone can be a bigot. Whatever pain you've been through does not give you the right to take it out on anyone else. And it was also, really doing this post-Martin Luther King idea. A person should be judged by their character, not just their identity. And in the 90s show, it mostly stuck with that, with the idea that it was an allegory for racism and anti-racism, but also they did add the idea, the people who worked on the original X-Men 90s show, that maybe being a mutant is also an allegory for what kids go through when they go through puberty and learning how to accept themselves. Now, the creators of the original X-Men show, when they were going through this controversy over Morph being a non-binary character now, said that the kids who watched the original X-Men show who are now having a problem with this must not have gotten it. But here's the problem with that. When kids were growing up watching the 90s X-Men show, they thought that they were watching a show that was about, not judging other people of different races or cultures or learning to accept themselves as they grew up. As time changed, the definition of being a bigot during the 2020s expanded to mean if you don't support gender ideology, which is what Morph, being a non-binary character, was getting into, which was not a thing in the mainstream during the time when the 90s X-Men aired. In fact, it's kind of embarrassing for them to say that people who grew up during that time just didn't get it, when if you read late 80s X-Men comics, Jubilee actually makes what would now be considered a transphobic joke about the name X-Men. And all of this is to say, once again, the ideology changes. The definition of what it means to be progressive changes. What was progressive for a kid's show in the 90s, the definition of what would it mean to be progressive these days changed when it came to X-Men 97 and the kinds of things that they thought they needed to put in the show. And I gotta say, it's still changing, because since X-Men 97 aired in short order, you actually see Disney removing transgender characters and storylines from their shows, because it's becoming less acceptable to do that, as there's becoming a lot of backlash and discussion around that ideology, which once again is not me telling you what to think when it comes to that whole way of thinking. It is showing, though, that things are constantly changing, and that some things that are acceptable 5 years ago won't be acceptable 10 years from now, and different schools of thought are going to completely change. And sometimes it isn't that the audience changed or never really got it, but it's just that the ideology changed, and not all the audience behind the scenes agreed with it. Maybe a lot of the audience misses the old ways that things used to be and never stopped agreeing with the old ways. As a final note, since we're on the topic of Marvel Comics, I want to show you guys another thing. There's been a lot of talk with Marvel these days, and Marvel and MCU movies and all of that, about the tokenism and how they seem to prioritize pushing diversity and forcing diversity and fitting out these quotas more than anything else. And some people would say that that is a good thing. All diversity is good diversity. And if you don't like the way that they're doing that, then that could only be because you're a morally bad person and have negative motives behind that. But did you know that the original Marvel comics were actually against diversity quotas? Here's a panel from Avengers 183, published in 1979 with Sam Wilson. Cap says, "It's not my idea, Sam. The government says we have to have more minority members, and if you don't join, the Avengers priority privileges will be suspended." "Oh well then, maybe I ought to change my name to The Token, huh? Blast it, Steve, I've proven myself as a superhero, and I don't like being chosen to fill a quota." And you can actually find multiple panels like that in comics from the previous decades, that the progressives, and most of the people who worked on these comics were very progressive at the time, they disagreed with tokenism. They disagreed that there needed to be diversity quotas enforced. In fact, they actually saw it as wrong to do that. They saw it as wrong to turn people into tokens just based on their identity and the appearance of it, which clearly has changed with what we've seen happen to a lot of these Marvel Comics characters today. Which is all to say is you can't just hand wave everything and say, well, it was always progressive. It hasn't changed. You have, or you never got it in the first place. No, the people behind these stories changed, and the idea of what it meant to be progressive changed. In fact, the idea of what it means to be progressive will look very different in the future. We're already seeing some of it change, and it's completely disingenuous to just take a surface level look of it and say, well, it's progressive, so it's the same, when it's actually not. And with a lot of these things, it isn't that the people who watched them and loved them or read these comics changed. It's maybe that they stayed the same as some of the ideology from these original shows and comics, but then the new stuff changed. Now, once again, I'm a media person. I watch shows and movies and I respond to trends. I am not a political expert at all. Don't come to me for all of your political knowledge at all. But what I am saying is while progressivism is always going to change and whatnot, this current form of progressivism that we've been seeing in media, I'm very tired of, because it's been like a leech. The modern form of progressivism has sucked out the life of these various franchises that I've loved, whether it's Marvel Comics or Star Wars or Star Trek, and they've been kind of sucked dry and left to melt like a slug that's had salt poured on it, for lack of a better term. And so I'm tired of it, and I want to move on, and I just want to leave this form of progressivism in the dust, because when it comes to what it does to media, it's not anything good. It just removes, and it's not even truthful. When you look at a show about a military academy and they're all acting like children and they're effeminate and many of them are overweight, there's no truth to any of this. But that is all I've got for you guys today. What do you think of this discussion? Once again, this was all just off the cuff stuff, but let me know in the comments below. That is my response to someone who says that you never got Star Trek or Star Trek was never for you. Let me know what you think of all of this in the comments below. If you want to support me, please consider becoming a member or a Patreon, and I will see you guys next time.